Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and for a very long time, when it comes to defining life in biology, things were relatively simple. You were either alive or you weren't. And in this case, a typical high school textbook usually gives us a kind of a checklist for defining life. Living things have to be able to reproduce, they have to have metabolism, and they should be able to respond to their environment. And so having all of these three checks basically makes you alive. So for example, bacteria, alive. Cats, dogs, alive. But what about viruses? Well, here things get super complicated because for decades the consensus was that no, they don't seem to be alive, but biologists mostly viewing viruses as a kind of a biological machine or some kind of a rogue genetic code that required hosts to mostly do everything and could not survive by itself. So essentially here the reproduction and even metabolism functions were not present. But in the last few decades, as we started to look around more, and as we started to discover some biological extremes, most of which have actually been found deep in the oceans, this line between living and non-living has not just become very thin, it has now almost completely vanished. As in some cases, it's actually difficult to tell if something is alive or it's not. And so in this video, we're going to focus on these two extremely recent discoveries that are both kind of mind-blowing, that are going to be forcing biologists to rethink our definitions, and specifically definitions of biological entities and life itself. And so here we're going to discuss certain giant viruses recently discovered and reported in this study, while also discussing certain strange minimal bacteria that have almost no genes left inside, both of which are extremely difficult to explain. But I guess to start, so let's basically discuss some of the smallest living things first, and especially certain organisms that are officially considered to be definitely alive. And so basically let's start with some of the well-defined limits. And when it comes to genes, this limit was always around a few hundred genes, as in the organism had to have at least a few hundred genes to exhibit all of the necessary conditions to be alive. For example, Mycoplasma genitalium is known to contain only 580,000 base pairs, which code for approximately 480 genes. And as the name implies, this is a sexually transmitted pathogen that usually lives in the genitals in humans. And so, for all you know, depending on how naughty you are, you might contain this. But today, the bacterium with the smallest known genome is what's known as Carcinella rudii. It's actually at least 3 times smaller and only contains 182 protein-coding genes. And one of the ways it's able to survive on so few genes is by basically being a symbiont. It lives inside insects and usually relies on the host insect for its survival while providing something in return. It actually only resides in a very specialized organ known as the bacterium, and it seems to supply these insects with certain essential amino acids. And the thing is, in some insects, certain bacteria might even have less genes. For example, certain plant hoppers seem to contain bacteria known as Vidania, whose genome is at least 3 times smaller than the previously mentioned Carcinella rudii. And to put that in perspective, that's actually not so different from a typical virus such as the COVID-19 virus. Or basically in terms of the size, their genome is very similar. Yet we don't think of COVID-19 as a living thing, but we do believe Vidania are alive. Except that in this case, they seem to have lost almost everything except for their ability to produce a single amino acid for their host, making these bacteria truly unusual. They're actually sometimes referred to as the intracellular beta-proteobacteria that seem to act as nutritional symbionts for several species of insects. And because they co-evolved like this for 130 million years, with time they lost most of their function. Intriguingly, as you can see from this image, they also seem to mostly reside inside the wings. And right now their only job is to produce phenylalanine, a chemical precursor amino acid that's normally responsible for making the insect exoskeleton much stronger. But I guess what's interesting about these bacteria is that they also seem to live inside the cells, and so in some sense they actually kind of function like mitochondria, the organelles inside all of our cells that once upon a time, billions of years ago, used to be bacteria as well. Except that in this case, they're still bacteria and they're still kind of independent and simply reside within the host cell. And also their genome is much smaller at 15,000 base pairs, whereas for this bacterium it seems to be 50,000. And so right now researchers believe that these are still alive and they're still independent, but are very likely just in different places on the evolutionary gradient compared to mitochondria and compared to all other bacteria. As a matter of fact, based on this recent study you can find in the description, scientists believe that there might be even bacteria with smaller genomes that are possibly even closer to becoming just organelles than just a part of some other cell. In other words, there might be certain bacteria that we can no longer define as living, mostly because they just became a part of something else. As always, you can learn more about this in the study in the description. And so here we have our first blurred boundary. A very strange bacterium that crossed this line between living and non-living, and that's very difficult to define as one or the other. These bacteria are so integrated into their hosts that they're essentially now almost organelles and barely do anything themselves. And so the question is, at what point does the living organism, in this case a living bacterium, stops being living? And well, right here we don't really have a good answer. But now let's take a look at this from the other side. From the non-living, basically behaving kind of like the living. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum, the giant viruses, sometimes also referred to as gyruses. And these were first truly recognized back in 2003 with the discovery of mimivirus, a virus that was actually mistaken for a bacterium at first just because it was so large and because it was actually visible with a simple light microscope. And while by definition these viruses usually have genomes larger than 200,000 base pairs, or essentially 4 times as large as the bacterium we've just discussed. Once again, Vidania only has 50,000. And some of these viruses, like the Pandoravirus salinis, even have genomes of over 2.4 million base pairs containing 2,500 genes. But here it's not just the size that matters, but also what they're capable of doing. And while traditionally the rule was that viruses cannot make their own proteins, that's why they were never believed to be alive. All of them were thought to lack translational machinery, or basically the factory called ribosomes, that turns genetic code into biological structures. But discovery of these giant viruses broke that rule, with this recent study from 2026 by Max Fals and Amy Lee discovering that giant DNA viruses actually do encode their own version of translation initiation complex, in this case referred to as VIF4F. Or in more simple terms, this is a molecular switch that allows these viruses to create their own proteins. And though a normal virus usually has to use the host cell to do all of this, these giant viruses seem to bring their own machinery, even though they still rely on the host cell. But why exactly does this matter? Or I guess more importantly, why would a virus bother bringing its own translational tools? Well, the answer here seems to be resilience. When a cell is under stress, maybe it's starving or dealing with heat, it usually shuts down its protein factories to save energy. And so for a lot of different bacteria, they usually enter a dormant state. But most normal viruses would be stuck and possibly just completely disappear if the host factory is closed and if the machinery is no longer working. But these giant viruses with the VIF4F don't seem to care about this stress. Because they bring their own initiation complexes, they can basically keep the viral factory going even if the cell is trying to shut down. And that actually allows them to thrive in extreme environments, like for example in Siberian permafrost or deep sea vents. And for this they even have their own special chemical tags at the start of their genetic code. As a matter of fact, this particular tag is recognized by the viral genome, or specifically the viral complexes, but the host cell is unable to use this, which basically ensures that the virus's structural proteins, like the capsids, the stuff that usually forms the viral body, is built efficiently and results in a virus that's functional. Which essentially means that this particular giant virus developed an extremely complex molecular hijacking technique that seems to be way more sophisticated than anything we've ever seen. And more importantly, it seems to contain functions that we usually attribute to life, and not to non-living viruses. And so here they are not just using the cell, they're physically reprogramming its core functions to serve the virus's own evolutionary goals. And that, of course, once again, seems to create this very unusual, difficult to define boundary of what exactly is living and what is not. And so this particular virus presents us with a new kind of a mystery, which of course is a concept that a lot of scientists have discussed previously. As a matter of fact, there is something known as the virocell. Some scientists argue that the living part of the virus isn't really the tiny particle floating in the air, but rather the infected cell itself. When a giant virus takes over an amoeba and starts its own metabolism and protein synthesis, the entire complex actually becomes a new living entity that researchers sometimes refer to as a virocell. Now, some scientists don't like this concept, but it's one of the possible ways of seeing viruses alive. But second, we also have this question of where exactly did these viruses even learn this? Did a lot of these giant viruses start as simple ones and eventually steal these complexes over millions of years, basically acquiring them from bacteria or possibly evolving them in some other way? Or are these giant viruses just shrunken versions of ancient cells, such as different bacteria, that basically became parasites and over many millions of years eventually lost all of their functions? Or alternatively, maybe the giant viruses are actually their own domain of life. Although in this case, this particular proposition is not widely accepted. Mostly because giant viruses do share a lot of things with bacteria, and so they're a lot more likely to have started as bacteria back in the days. But ultimately, all of this basically tells us that life seems to be not really binary. As in, it's not just living and not living. It's more of a spectrum of complexity that contains a lot of different things. As a matter of fact, even things like prions, or these self-replicating proteins we've discussed previously in the video in the description, can also replicate, but do not contain their own code, and so they're also kind of in that blurry boundary between life and not life. And we also have things like recently discovered viroids, which are basically just naked loops of RNA. And so, along with these giant viruses and these tiny bacteria, we essentially have this very strange spectrum. A spectrum where it's actually kind of difficult to define exactly what life is, and exactly what non-living beings are as well. In other words, the high school definition of life is extremely outdated and doesn't really make a lot of sense. But all of this is not just some kind of a intellectual curiosity. This is important for a lot of different biological and medical fields. Mostly because it helps us monitor different pathogens and also understand how ecosystems are regulated, especially since giant viruses in the ocean generally control a lot of things. For example, they control the algal blooms that very often produce a huge portion of the Earth's oxygen. And so in that sense, understanding giant viruses is extremely important. And that means that by studying these borderline entities, we're not just learning about viruses and strange bacteria, we're learning about the very origin of protein synthesis and the mechanical heart of life itself. But also, the more we look, the more we realize that the universe doesn't seem to care about our definitions, or I guess our categories. And that's because nature, in general, seems to be kind of messy, kind of chaotic, and absolutely fascinating. On that note, thank you so much for watching. We'll definitely come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos once there are some additional discoveries, but until then, check out previous videos on giant viruses and a lot of other stuff in the description below. Subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access and a few additional things. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.